A couple weeks ago, I posted a video on my channel on how to set up a ball python enclosure, and I got a lot of positive responses after posting that video. I then decided to make a poll asking you guys which how-to video do you want to see next, to which basically everybody said they wanted to see how to set up a corn snake enclosure. So let's talk about everything you'll need to correctly set up a corn snake enclosure. I think because corn snakes are advertised as beginner snakes, people often think that beginner means most affordable. And that's not always the case. When you go to a pet shop or an exotic reptile shop, you often see baby corn snakes. It's very rare that you'll go to a show or a store and see an adult corn snake. And baby corn snakes are very tiny. So you're looking at a snake that's like a foot long in length, and you're thinking, how hard could it possibly be to take care of this little ramen noodle? But a lot of people don't understand that corn snakes actually get pretty long. They can actually range from about 4 to 5 feet in length, and there are some corn snakes that reach 6 feet in length. So if we're talking about the long-term care of that animal, the price of their enclosure is going to be cheap in the beginning, and it's going to get more expensive as they grow out and need that bigger enclosure. So now let's talk about which enclosure you should buy for your corn snake. Remember that the guideline for enclosure size is that the length of your enclosure should be longer than your snake. But here's where people make this common mistake. You have a corn snake that's about a foot long, and so you think that putting it in something like a 10-gallon aquarium is suitable because the length of that 10-gallon aquarium is longer than the length of that snake. What people don't consider are two important things. Number one, the activity of the corn snake, and number two, establishing a proper heat gradient, which we'll get into the next category. Corn snakes are very active. That being said, adult corn snakes that are 4 feet in length need to be in at least a 4x2x2 enclosure, and adult corn snakes that are greater than 4 feet in length should really be in a 5x2x2 enclosure. Corn snakes are also semi-arboreal. They love to climb, and so having that 2 feet of space, especially for adults, is essential to make sure that they can climb and exhibit all of those natural behaviors that they would do in the wild. With baby corn snakes, it is very tricky. Number one, because they are so small, they are masters of escape. Ideally, the best enclosure for corn snakes are going to be a front opening enclosure. The reason why we like to choose front opening enclosures is because when we're going in and picking up our snake, a front opening enclosure allows us to be able to come in from the front and handle our snakes versus going over them on the top, creating a shadow like a bird and snapping them into defense mode. Problem that I had when I got my corn snake as a baby is a lot of the front opening enclosures, especially the glass ones, have little holes for ventilation in the front, which can be pretty big. Even when you have a, let's say, a dubia enclosure and you have the sliding doors and you put the lock into the sliding doors, it kind of creates a gap in the doors. And I'll definitely insert a pic of what I'm talking about. But my biggest fear was that my corn snake would somehow squeeze through that gap. Ideally, if I had a baby corn snake, I would put them in something that we like to call a groa enclosure. This is an enclosure that's smaller than their adult enclosure that they can sit in while they grow. And basically, as they reach about 2.5 to 3 feet in length is when you would transfer them into that adult size enclosure, which is going to be either that 4x2x2, or if you want to give them extra space and anticipate them possibly hitting 5 feet in length, then a 5x2x2. My recommendation for baby corn snakes is going to be at least a 40-gallon front opening enclosure. The 40-gallon front opening enclosure is going to allow you to have that proper heat gradient, but it's also going to allow your corn snake to go around and be able to explore the tank. I believe the 40-gallon terrariums are about 16 inches in height, so that's a good enough height for that baby to go and climb, add a bunch of climbing opportunities in there. As far as the enclosure material, I personally like to use PVC enclosures, but I know people that use like the Exoterra glass terrariums, go wood. Just go ahead and research the pros and cons of each of those enclosure types. In summary, we're going to put our baby corn snakes or juvenile corn snakes in at least a 40-gallon front opening terrarium, and we're going to put adults that are under 4 feet in length in a 4x2x2 and adults that are greater than 4 feet in length in a 5x2x2. So I mentioned the importance of having a heat gradient in our corn snake enclosure. So let's now get into the topic of heating and lighting. Corn snakes need overhead heating. The best proven source of heating for corn snakes is going to be an overhead halogen bulb. These halogen bulbs give off IRA, which is infrared type A, which is the infrared type that is able to penetrate our snake's skin at the deepest level, keeping them warmer for longer. This is the infrared type that is also found in the sun. IRA is the reason why we can step outside in the sun on a hot day and then come inside and still feel like we're burning up and dying inside. And that's what we want for our snakes because they are ectotherms and their internal temperature will always match their external temperature. With any heat source, it is important that we plug in our heat source into a light dimming thermostat. My favorite light dimming thermostat that I use is from Reptizoo, and you guys can find that on my Amazon storefront. As far as wattage goes, because I do want to talk about wattage, if you have a 40-gallon enclosure, I'm going to recommend buying a 50-watt halogen bulb. If you have a 4x2x2, I will recommend to start off with a 75-watt, and I will also recommend a 75-watt for that 5x2x2. But of course, all of us live in different climates. See what works best for you, but definitely start on the lower wattage side. Like I said in previous videos, it's better to have a lower wattage bulb that's not being dimmed as much to get that optimal temperature versus having a much higher wattage bulb that's being dimmed by like 60%, because then we're not getting the full effectiveness of that bulb. So we have our main source of heat, which is going to be our halogen heat bulb. And now let's talk about supplemental heating. If your house is reaching low 70 degrees Fahrenheit and below, that's when you might want to look into getting a low wattage deep heat projector. What makes the deep heat projector most ideal is that it's a bulb that gives off heat with zero light. It's important that at night that our snakes have zero light whatsoever and we're stimulating that proper day and night cycle. The key, however, is having a low wattage deep heat projector. At night, we see that temperatures where our corn snakes live in the wild, those nighttime temperatures dip at night. And so we want to replicate that cycle. So if we have our halogen bulbs plugged in and the ambient temperature during the day is 86 degrees, and then at night you're flipping on a deep heat projector that's also at 90 degrees, then our snake isn't getting that natural dip in temperature. So we're going to use that deep heat projector at night only. And because it is a heat source, we are also going to plug that into a thermostat. So now we have our main heat source as well as our supplemental heat source if we're living in a cold environment. So now let's talk about linear UVB. Corn snakes are crepuscular, which means that they are active at both dawn and dusk. That being said, your corn snakes are very likely to go under that UVB during the day, which is going to be beneficial to their immunity and overall health. The linear UVB that I use in my corn snake enclosure is going to be the Arcadia Shade Dweller Pro 7% linear UVB. And if you have a solar meter and you want to check the output of that UVB level, we're looking for a range of 2.0 to 3.0. Now let's talk about linear LED lights. Linear LED lights is something that I don't see on a lot of corn snake supply lists, but I personally think that because there are crepuscular species, having that linear LED lights can really help you push that day and night cycle to the next level. If you are a bioactive keeper, then you're going to want that linear LED light in your enclosure anyway, because that's what's going to allow your plants to grow. The light that you're looking for is going to be specifically a full spectrum LED light. So we talked about all the different types of lighting, but now let's talk about how this should be set up in your enclosure. Corn snakes are able to bask, meaning go out and be directly under the sun, but they're also able to hide under leaves and branches and tree shade. What we're essentially doing is we're taking their entire habitat and putting it into a 4-foot enclosure. So the best way that we can replicate those cool areas and then those warm areas that they would get to move between in the wild is by creating a heat gradient. That means that the furthest side of one of your enclosures will be the warmest part of the enclosure, and then the far other side of the enclosure will be the cooler part of your enclosure. So your temperature will go from high to low, therefore creating a heat gradient. Let's start with placing the linear UVB. Pick either the left side or the right side. Whichever side it is, make sure it's either the furthest to the left or the furthest to the right. And we're going to mount that linear UVB inside of the enclosure. The reason why we choose to light that linear UVB inside of the enclosure is because Arcadia actually notes that putting your linear UVB on top of the mesh part of your enclosure, if you have a mesh top enclosure, actually reduces the UVB output by around 35%. So it's definitely optimal for you to mount that linear UVB inside of your enclosure. It could be horizontal, it could be diagonal, it could be vertical. Whichever way you do it, mount it inside of your enclosure. If you have a mesh enclosure, the way I like to do this is by taking some aluminum wire. I'll just tie it around the base of the light, fish it through the top mesh, and then tie a knot, and I'll do that in 3 different spots so it's even. After we place that linear UVB, we're going to place our halogen heat bulb. You have 2 options when it comes to placing the halogen heat bulb. 1, you could place it on the outside of your enclosure, so on top of the enclosure, or 2, you can place it on the inside of the enclosure. If you have something like a wooded enclosure, something that's a solid top, your only choice is going to be to mount the lighting inside of the enclosure. If you have a mesh top enclosure, then you have the option of having a dome fixture that sits on top, or you have the option of doing a light cage that goes on the inside. This is what's very important. Corn snakes are not like ball pythons. They are very small, tiny snakes. That being said, a lot of the cages that people sell to go over these heat sources, the holes in those heat cages are way too big and your snake can go through them. And remember that these snakes are crepuscular, which means that they could be active when that light is turned on during the day. And the last thing that you want to do is create an opportunity for your snake to fit through that hole and go in and touch that bulb and, God forbid, burn themselves. So this is a very real danger. Make sure that if you're mounting that lighting inside, that your cages have very tiny holes. I actually just ordered the perfect cage from Amazon that I'm gonna have listed in my storefront for you guys, or maybe I'll even just put the link in the description. But the holes are very small. It's perfect for a corn snake. If you have a baby corn snake, I just say play it safe and go ahead and just get that light dome fixture that just sits on top of the enclosure until they get a lot thicker in width. So where should that halogen bulb be placed next to that linear UVB? Research shows the optimal location for the halogen heat bulb is actually in the direct center of that linear UVB. So I'll show a couple pictures of what that means. So if you have your linear UVB mounted vertically, you're gonna put that halogen bulb directly in the center next to that. This essentially creates an effective basking zone. The strongest output of the linear UVB is located at the center of the bulb. So when we put the heat source directly next to the center of the linear UVB, that's going to encourage our snake to go right through that center, therefore absorbing the maximum amount of UVB while getting the maximum level of heat. As far as placing the deep heat projector, doesn't matter where you put it because this is going to be on by itself at night. But I know that a lot of people just like to put it next to that halogen bulb. They also like, if you're putting your lighting on top of the enclosure on the outside, buying those double dome heat fixtures. So you could just have one that's the deep heat projector and the other one that's the halogen, and then you have the bulbs switching on and off, whether it's day, whether it's night. As far as the linear LEDs, mine just go across the center inside of the enclosure, preferably out of the way of the linear UVB and the halogen bulb. I like to plug all of my lighting into timers. If you are still manually turning on and off your lights during the day and at night, I applaud you. But work smarter, not harder. There are a lot of smart plugs, and then there are also the smart power strips. You could plug in multiple stuff into the outlets and set up a timer. Right now I have the Treat Life plugs on all of my lighting. It connects to an app on my phone, and I'm basically able to schedule when I want certain lights to turn on, when I want them to turn off, and I have those in my Amazon storefront, but they are single outlet plugs and they are kind of chunky. So even if you have a power strip that holds 4, because the blocks are kind of chunky, you'll probably only be able to fit 3. So I think maybe your best option, if you have multiple animals, and you're going to be plugging in multiple lightings for different enclosures in the same outlet strip, is to just get a power strip where the whole thing's connected to a timer. It'll make your life a little bit easier. So we talked about enclosure size, we got down heating and lighting and how that should be set up in our enclosure. So let's now get into decorating the enclosure. Let's talk about substrate. An important natural behavior that corn snakes exhibit in the wild is burrowing. Corn snakes love to burrow in the ground, and so it's important that we have a very thick substrate layer that our corn snakes are able to completely burrow themselves inside of the ground whenever they want to. At the same time, we need to make sure that this substrate is able to hold plants if we want to have a bioactive enclosure, and we also want to make sure that it's able to hold a certain amount of humidity for our enclosure. For me and many other keepers, that ideal substrate for corn snakes is going to be a 50-50% mix of some organic topsoil and some play sand. I want to elaborate on what organic topsoil means because we say it a lot, but we don't really talk about what it actually means for a soil to be organic. When we say organic topsoil, we're looking for a topsoil that doesn't have any fertilizers or any pesticides in it. Definitely take a look at the ingredients on the back of the bag. If you are buying soil from like a department store or gardening store, I urge you to really take a look at those ingredients and make sure that that soil does not contain peat moss. Although moss is really good in our enclosures for humidity, peat moss itself, the way that it's harvested, is actually really harmful to the environment. So if you care about the environment, stay away from peat moss. If you don't want to use the organic topsoil, I would recommend Reptisoil. I will say that anytime I do get that topsoil from a department store, I do go ahead and hand sift through that entire bag because you will see that there are little chunks of plastic or just little things in there that shouldn't be in there. So really sift through that soil and preferably go ahead and bake it in your oven at about 250 degrees Fahrenheit for around 30 minutes. Bioactive keepers. Let's talk about a drainage layer. Do you need one for a corn snake enclosure? Doing my research on bioactive corn snake enclosures, I noticed one thing. Every single person who created a corn snake enclosure that I have seen has not used a drainage layer. I think this is because this is a type of enclosure that is low humidity relative to something like a ball python or a Brazilian rainbow boa. So there's not going to be a lot of moisture in the tank. The purpose of a drainage layer is that water doesn't sit and saturate your substrate. It's when you water your plants that need to be watered regularly, that water seeps down into that drainage layer. And ideally, you're supposed to have something like a PVC pipe in the corner with holes drilled onto it that sticks into your drainage layer so that that water has a route to escape into that PVC pipe up into the environment and turn into water vapor and increase your humidity. It is important to note, and I was talking to one of my mutuals about this the other day, that if you have a PVC enclosure or a wood enclosure, they're not made to hold water. So there's an extra step you have to go into making sure that that enclosure is essentially waterproof and can take that water at the bottom. For wood enclosures, you're going to have to seal it, otherwise the whole entire enclosure is going to mold and you're going to have to deal with that. If you're using something like a phyllo enclosure, a Dubia enclosure, a Zen enclosure, it's really important that you're sealing the sides of the enclosure. And I also recommend purchasing something called a biobasin that Zen Habitat sells, which is essentially like a waterproof tarp that goes on the bottom of your tank, preventing water from touching your tank. Let's talk about humidity. For the longest time, I was taught that corn snake humidity should range from 40% to 60%. I'm now starting to see that sources are saying that corn snakes need a humidity of 65 to 75%, which is definitely a lot higher than 40%. My advice is to do one of two things. Number one, just like how we have a heat gradient, you can create a humidity gradient. Sphagnum moss is one of the best things ever at keeping humidity up. Take a clump of some sphagnum moss and maybe stick it in a corner or mix it up in the substrate on the warm side of your enclosure. And then when you go to mist your enclosure, you can go ahead and mist that substrate. And now you have an area of high humidity on one side, on your warm side. And as you move to your cooler side, you have an area of lower humidity. Option number two is to have a humid hide. Humid hides are basically going to be a hide that is stuffed with sphagnum moss that you can mist regularly. An important tool that we are going to need in our enclosure to measure the humidity is going to be a hygrometer. And I prefer to use digital hygrometers just because they're more accurate. And the ones on my Amazon storefront actually come in a pack of two, and they are both a hygrometer and a thermometer. So you can place one on the warm side, you can place one on the cool side, and you will be able to measure the relative humidity as well as the relative temperature in that area. I also recommend that all reptile keepers purchase an infrared temperature gun. It's basically going to allow you to measure all of the areas around the enclosure instead of just that general area. You can actually pinpoint it and measure all the different areas on the enclosure. We can now move into the fun part of decorating the enclosure. At the minimum, I will say you want 2 to 3 hides. You're going to want a hide on your warm side and you're going to want a hide on your cool side. And if you are doing that humid hide, then you're going to want a humid side that's also on the warm side, but just filled up with some sphagnum moss. I see a lot of people with very, very tiny corn snakes and they give them these gigantic hides. And I want to tell you that these gigantic hides are not going to allow them to feel safe. What makes these snakes feel safe is actually being in very enclosed, tight spaces. So you want to make sure that if you have a tiny snake, you are getting a tiny hide. My favorite thing to do, besides just taking a hide and simply placing it on the left and placing it on the right, is you can get a little bit creative with it. One thing I like to do is take one of those plastic hides from Amazon. Because our substrate layer is so thick, I'll actually take that hide, put it on one side of the enclosure, and completely cover the hide with that substrate, creating what looks like a burrow hide. Not all of your hides need to be the little black box hides. They can be more fun. I see some that have, the little rocks, or I personally love the most naturalistic hide, which are cork rounds. I have cork rounds in all of my enclosures as they can hide in between it, climb on top of them. It's going to be really enriching for them and it really makes the tank look very naturalistic. You can now pick something that you want to use to create a basking zone, which is going to be directly under that heat bulb and directly under that linear UVB. The most inexpensive way to create a platform for a basking spot is going to be using some type of slate or some type of brick garden stone. Really cheap at your local hardware store, or even find the slates at any fish doors. Put that right underneath that heat source, and now you have an area where your snake can literally bask, so they can lay on top of that rock, and that heat that's being reflected from that rock is able to go underneath their bellies, and they're able to absorb all of that heat. That platform is going to be where you want to put the probe for your light dimming thermostat. When you plug in your heating into a light dimming thermostat, you're going to set the temperature to whatever temperature you want. You're going to take that probe and you're going to place it right on top of that basking platform so that when your snake is crawling around it, it's not too hot where it can burn their bellies. I like to set all of my light dimming thermostats on my basking spot to about 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The next type of decor for the ground is going to be foliage, which is going to be your live or fake plants, and leaf litter. Leaf litter is so enriching for corn snakes. You're going to see them slither through it and crawl underneath it. And if you have a bioactive setup, it's going to be really great for your cleaning crew as well. You can go out and buy leaf litter at a local pet store or on my Amazon storefront. Or if you know the source of certain trees in your area, like maybe a fruit tree, and you have those dead leaves on the floor, you can actually rake those leaves up and make your own leaf litter by boiling those leaves and drying them. You want to severely clutter that enclosure, especially if you're deciding to take a juvenile corn snake and putting them inside their adult size enclosure. This is a really good example of a type of plant that I would put in a corn snake enclosure. It's very voluminous, it stretches out very far. Your snake's going to be able to crawl through it. You can also have one that looks more like this guy. This is like a fake fern. Going to help you take up a lot of that space and fill in all of those empty gaps so that your snake feels really safe. Pick up any plastic plants that don't have any smells to it or have any extra like powder or glitter on them. I always like to take all of those plastic plants that I use, put them in some hot vinegar water and let that soak for a few hours before putting them in my enclosure. If you are going the bioactive route, I have some plant recommendations for you to start with. Popular plants that people like to use in their corn snake enclosure is going to be pothos, which are those vining plants, snake plants, ferns, grasses, and palms. If you are using live plants, it is really important to disinfect your plants. Anytime you're getting plants from a department store, they tend to use a lot of pesticides or fertilizers in there. So it's really important that before we take a plant like that and put it into an environment with our live animals, that we're really disinfecting it and making sure that we're not carrying any unwanted visitors inside of our enclosure. The best way to do this is by disinfecting them in a bowl of some hydrogen peroxide and water, or some people do dish soap and water. Some people do alcohol and water. They basically use this dunk method where you essentially submerge your plant in that mixture of the water, get rid of all that substrate that the plant came in, really get into the leaves, and the hydrogen peroxide and soap essentially kills any pests that could have been living on there. And once you do that, it'll be safe and ready for you to put inside of your enclosure. Next is a water bowl. Pick whichever one you want. I prefer the ceramic ones because they're just a lot easier to clean. Now that we've established all of the decor on the ground, let's talk about decorating the top half of our enclosure. Because as I said before, corn snakes are semi-arboreal, which means that if given the opportunity, it will most likely climb. My favorite types of branches to put inside of my enclosures are going to be driftwood, grapevine, and ghostwood. I really like to pick a really big wood piece when it comes to creating climbing opportunities in my enclosures, and I just like to stick that in the middle. You can tie it up with that aluminum wire trick where you kind of tie the top of the branch, fish it through the top mesh, tie a knot. You can hold it up with tension. You can silicone it to the side of your enclosure. There's many ways to do it. And because corn snakes aren't super big bodied snake, these aren't the type of snakes that you really have to worry about them knocking something down. If you have a good heavy piece of wood, it should be able to sit with tension, hitting the side of the enclosure and being dug into the substrate, especially since we have a thick substrate layer. Another climbing opportunity that I love are vines. I really like the Exoterra jungle vines, securing them, bending them in different directions, making them intertwine with one another, securing it to either the rods at the top of my enclosure with that aluminum wire or through the top with zip ties. It really fills in the top half of that enclosure. I personally do not like the look of enclosures that are very full on the bottom and then the top half is completely empty. It just looks half done to me. So having those vines really helps fill in that empty gap, and it really makes the enclosure look complete to me. The last two things that I'll recommend for your corn snake enclosure is number one, which is optional, which is going to be a camera. You can monitor your snake's activity because a lot of the times they're going to be mainly out at night when we're asleep. Or early in the morning when you might be still asleep. So it could be nice to have a camera in there and be able to check up on your snake and see what they're doing and see where they like to spend most of their time in the enclosure, monitor their behavior, etc. And then the last thing is going to be an enclosure lock. even though you may think that your snake isn't capable of pushing open the enclosure door. If you have a cat like me or a dog, or even like a child running around, it's just really important to have that extra security lock on that door to prevent the snake from escaping. The locks that I use are also on my Amazon storefront, and I believe that those are also in a pack of 2. But that is everything that you will possibly need to create the best corn snake enclosure. If you're getting a corn snake in the future, then I hope that this inspires your first setup. Or if you have a corn snake already, then maybe perhaps this inspired you to make some changes. Whichever it is, I'm happy you stayed to the end, and stay tuned because very soon we're going to be doing how to build a bearded dragon enclosure. But until then, you can catch me over on Instagram and TikTok.